Kaya everyone, I have decided to take a different approach in the representation of Aboriginality. My presentation, titled Mainstream Media Subconsciously Influencing the Discourse of Aboriginal Representation, will explore how Indigenous people are represented in the media and how that representation then influences and shapes a person's perception unknowingly by belying the reality. It will also explore the relationship between media reporting, political agendas, and community perceptions and the impact it has on Aboriginal people, drawing on the normalisation of racism within society from colonisation. I would like to begin by recognising the traditional owners of the land on which I stand today, the Wathaurong people. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Please also note that this presentation may have videos, pictures and/or information that may cause distress amongst Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Everyday Australians turn to the media to gain information and reasonings of events and issues that are happening all over the nation. The everyday news has a powerful and permeating influence on how we all make sense of the world and the people around us. At times, commentators, reporters and politicians make racist statements about Indigenous people. Racism within the media also manifests in more subtle ways through the everyday media practices. These practices include news gatherings, analysis and presenting that then dictates the audience's responses and perceptions. Media has the responsibilities and the power to articulate and transmit persuasive, negative narratives, images and ideas about Indigenous communities, which has an enormous influence on shaping attitudes and the collective beliefs of mainstream Australia, where they usually belie the reality. Whether deliberate or unconscious, those who work in the media have the power to marginalise and contribute to discrimination of Indigenous people and have the ability to construct Indigenous communities as others and associate them with crime or conflict. Race is often used in Australian media as the cause, the reference point and even the catalyst for the conflicts and complexities in society. As a result of this, it is often underpinned by the normalisation of racism in society, where the process begins with blaming and targeting minority communities and where that then becomes justifiable because of the reasons and use of language portrayed from the media. These narratives take hold and use to justify and rationalise problems. They're explained or connected in the media in racial terms, which may legitimise prejudice and discrimination against Indigenous communities. A good example of this in the media is crime. I would say the majority of you here listening would have little to no experience firsthand in crime, and as a result of our lack of experience with crime, the media has therefore shaped our views and understandings of crime. There is substantial research that demonstrates the media overly focusing on alleged criminal activity of Indigenous people, with Indigenous people overrepresented in all forms of custody. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people experience considerably higher crime victimisation and imprisonment rates. The deaths in custody of Indigenous were alarming, which are increasingly common and a growing concern for everyone. This can be further explored in the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody report. Instead of helping us to understand the root of the conflicts or further explore the complexities in Australia's post-colonial and multicultural society, it fuels nationalism, further marginalises Indigenous people and adds to the notions of otherness. As mentioned before, whether deliberate or not, the damaging effects on Indigenous communities are the same. Politicians understand that audiences are positioned through language and images, which in the past have been interwoven into media coverage to favour their political agendas. They carefully construct communication with professional media staff, whose sole responsibilities is to convey the ideas and policies in certain ways to gain traction from the public. Complexities of media reporting and government rhetoric has become a feature within the political landscape. In 2004, John Howard announced the axing of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission. The government body was short-lived and the coverage by the media displayed strong themes of failure, blaming and feeding stereotypes that Aboriginal people are unable to govern with transparency and accountability. Remembering that initially it was the Australian government body that formally involved Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the processes directly affecting their lives, a government body promoting Aboriginal autonomy that gave an alternative voice on policy that would better reflect the Aboriginal people. Although for the most, Aboriginal people never understood the Commission as autonomous or self-determining, as was instead seen to compound rather alleviate Aboriginal dependency. The media coverage to abolish the body was largely focused on the sexual assault allegations against Deputy Chair, and the government body was a failed experiment rather than highlighting the policy program's successes. It was conveyed as a failure by the government and reaffirmed by the media because of the socio-economic statistics for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people still showing large levels of disadvantage rather than improvement, giving the government leeway to abolish with little outcry from the public. There was rarely any mention of the large amount of funding being quarantined, but rather conveyed as poorly servicing the Indigenous communities. The body failing to be responsible for key areas such as education and health gave the government justifiable reasons to axe the Commission with the public's support. The government then portrayed the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Commission body as a distraction from the critical issues. Yet today, in its absence, the issues are as prevalent as they ever were. As a result, this led to the public's perception that Indigenous people were the source of the problems and disorders in society through the continuous confirmation in media reportage. These notions are then underpinned by values and beliefs that are given power through being normal, driving the normalisation of racism. This imprisons Australians in their own cultural cocoon that ensures other cultural groups living outside their cocoon are imprisoned and disadvantaged. This draws me to my next question. Where did this begin and when did racism become acceptable? Or is it that Australians are lying to themselves? Following philosopher Frantz Fanon's theory that people living in a racist society are lying to themselves and prejudice becomes so subconscious that the racist values become so familiar that they become invisible and silent that it permeates society, from the unequal and social conditions of oppression, discrimination and marginalisation that comes with colonisation. In Australia, Indigenous people and communities still struggle against post-colonial dependencies in their efforts to regain their autonomy. The move to shift Aboriginal peoples from autonomous societies to a dependent minority began at colonisation. This dependency arrived with the colonising forces that invaded Aboriginal lands and further developed during periods of dispossession, protectionism, and assimilation. Dispossession can be argued as the core of Indigenous disadvantage, as it saw Indigenous people lose control and having a spiritual, psychological, and traumatising impact. This destroyed Aboriginal self-worth and values in culture, with the trauma being carried intergenerations and still very relevant today. Aboriginal people had to seek acceptance and identity within their own communities. Governments encouraged and participated in tabloid journalism and media coverage. They subconsciously shaped attitudes by portraying Aboriginal people as criminals, threats to the wider community, and incapable of autonomy and governing. This created views that Aboriginal people need to be helped and forced to overcome their dependencies as a minority. These struggles were disheartening, and today Aboriginal people are most likely still experiencing less in the way of formal political autonomy than any other comparable settler society anywhere in the world. The media has a massive influence in shaping people's perceptions. They have an important role in educating the nation, changing attitudes and closing the gap between Indigenous Australians and non-Indigenous Australians. Directly and indirectly, the media is a medium used to convey views both positively and negatively. 2004 saw that Prime Minister John Howard and the Aboriginal and Torres Islander Commission portraying the public to think that self-determination had failed. Aboriginal autonomy would argue that real autonomy, has never been tried in Australia. Therefore, such an approach that has never really been tested cannot be deemed a failure. Years after the axing of the Australia and Torres Strait Islander Commission, Aboriginal people still don't have a voice. When you look at reports written 10 years ago or more, such as the Royal Commission in Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, and see that nothing much has changed, you begin to wonder if people want to change or if people are happy living in their own cultural cocoons. By acknowledging past injustices would mean we would have to question our own ethics, our family's ethics, and our community's ethics, and that may not fit into our protected cultural cocoon. And as a nation, we have not yet come to terms with racism. It is so embedded in society that it becomes a norm, with people so unaware of its presence and the impacts it has on Indigenous people and communities. Deliberate or not, the damaging impacts of media, political agendas, and the community's perceptions of Indigenous communities are the same now as they were years ago. We continue to see Australia put one step forward but then go 2 steps backwards. Australia has come a long way, but there still is a long way to go. I'll leave you now with a question. Do you think the media subconsciously influences the discourse of Aboriginal representation? Because I do. Thanks everyone for tuning in. I'm looking forward to reading your comments and hearing your thoughts.